first temple that was in the Garden of Eden, because Adam and Eve were actually the first temple. But because of their rebellion, guess what? When they were in the garden, guess what? They were full of God's glory. But because of their rebellion, guess what? They got expunged from the garden, which represented that God's glory had left out of Adam and Eve. And this is the same thing that happened with Solomon's temple. When they began to rebel against God, his Shekinah glory, his presence, left the temple and went up onto the east side of the Mount of Olives before they began to go into captivity. So now he's trying to get their mindset to understand. Don't forget about how things used to be, because sometimes you hear people talk about the good old days. If the truth be told, wasn't nothing good about the good old days. If it was the good old days, some of the people that you wanted to marry, have you seen them 30 and 40 years later? Ain't you glad God said no? So he asks them, who is left among you who saw this temple in its former glory? And how do you see it now in comparison with it? This is not it's nothing in your eyesight. And this is something that you and I need to understand. Understand that your eyes have the ability to deceive your mind. Understand that there's more to you than can be humanly comprehended. Understand it's not about others and what they see and might say. But the question God has for you and I is, what do you see? You need to know that your eyes don't have a voice. It's your mind that relays the language to them what it seems. In other words, guess what? Because you're looking at something, you can't really find out, or you really can't detect what it is. It is your mind that actually tells you what you're looking at. So that is why God had instructed you and I in the very beginning to simply say, don't let your eyes fool you, because everything that you see is really not what you see. That's why God also says, for as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Do you know that sometimes you and I become victorious? Why? Because we can't see victory with our human eye, but that's what we see it with what our mind's eye. So that's why he says, for as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. So you and I have to be able to take on this mentality that you and I never drink out of a glass that's half empty. In other words, what do you mean you never drink out of a glass half empty? It's actually, what does your mind see when you're looking at that glass? I've never drunk out of a half empty glass. I always drink out of a half full glass. Why? Because my mind tells me exactly what I see. And what do I see? I see the things of God. So God simply says, don't let your eyes fool you. So now he comes back to the question and he asks them, in your comparison of the way the first temple used to be, is this not in your eyes now, the thing that you're working on now? Does it not seem like it's insignificant? Does it seem like it's not going to amount to anything? And Zechariah had this type of understanding. Zechariah said, for who has despised the day of small things? In other words, some of the greatest things that ever happened never started out large. Some of the things always started out small. Jesus said, if you had the seed of a mustard seed, you could talk to a mountain and you could tell that mountain to move. And guess what? The mountain will not question you. The mountain will actually move if you just have the faith of a mustard seed. Understand this simple thing, that you and I can never ever neglect small things. What do you mean, Pastor, we can't neglect small things? Understand that God only spoke 4 words. He simply said, let there be light. And guess what? Creation stepped out of chaos. God breathed, and guess what? And man became a living soul. Understand that God dreamed in a man who was 100 years old, a man whose body had actually died, who was married to a woman who was 90 years old. And God told her that, look, you're going to give birth to a woman. And guess what? Sarah actually had the nerve to ask God. She says, actually, you're going to wait till I get 90 years old to ask me, am I going to have some pleasure? She wasn't talking about, was she going to birth a baby? She was talking about, was she going to have some fun having some sex? And when God breathed, guess what? He made Abraham birth forth a nation. God loved, and God loved us so much. What did he do after he began to love his own creation? God loved us so much that he began to release his only begotten son, who was Jesus. So God is simply saying, don't let your eyes fool you. Just because something looks small, you need to be able to see what God sees. You need to understand, never ever be intimidated by time. What do you mean, Pastor? Never be intimidated by time. You need to understand that we serve a God who's eternal. That simply means you have to get this picture in your mind. You have to look at it as a circle, and God sits on top of that. Why? Because he's eternal. And then you draw through a line that's called kairos and chronos. That's God's time and man's time. So God sits on top of eternity, and as he's sitting on top of eternity, then he begins to look into time, and then he releases his will from the eternity into time. So even though Abram was 100 years old, and everybody would say, well, my time has passed me by, God is simply saying, that wasn't, time hasn't passed you by. That was the right time. I was sitting on eternity, and I couldn't get glory out of it until everybody else